This is Jeff. I am making this video to introduce you to the basics of making typography in After Effects. After Effects is by far the most powerful motion typography application, but you'll see that it's based very deeply in the same interface as Illustrator and Photoshop. So that will make things a little easier based on familiarity alone. So I've generated this little bit here. Uh, it's all a quick little text animation. And I'm just going to walk you through how I built it because I think a lot of this should be pretty familiar. The first is the shape layer. That is the box. It has a trim path on it, which you should be pretty familiar with based on our work with Visual Music. And then I have 3 layers of type that are static and they just kind of appear in. You can basically adjust how they appear in simply by selecting the edge of their bar, and that kind of make things kind of trim in and out. The third is a bit of text that has a basic scale animation on it. So a lot of this is all pretty familiar. It's basically how this text is generated and manipulated, which is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to put my current time indicator where I can see the majority of that text, and I'm just going to select the layer big. You can notice if you select the layer above, it's going to be instantly editable. So all you have to do is select the layer and the text will become editable, at least in style. So I can come in here and change this to, say, a lighter blue. But if I want to actually change what the text says, I have to double click in here until I get a cursor, and then I can turn big to bag or back to big. Okay, so here we are. I've got selected big, and you can see in the character panel, you can select, of course, the typeface. I'm going to back up, and of course it's weight, is it bold, light, etc. You have a fill and a stroke, which you can swap back and forth, and of course you can double click to change the color. You'll have the scale here, so I can go from big to small, and these are things that we can animate, and we'll look at in a second. And so this should all be fairly simple and familiar from other Adobe applications. So I have another section over here on letting and tracking. So that's how it's manipulated, but let's create it. So there's a couple ways I can create text. One, I can either 2-finger click or right click in the timeline and go to New, Text. And that will create a new text layer. There's a tiny cursor in the center there, so if I just said letting and tracking, I can just type right in. Another way that I can generate text is go up here to the text tool, and I can choose either vertical or horizontal. I'm going to stick with horizontal, and this time I'm going to invert that and start with letting and tracking. So there's 2 ways that you can generate it. I'm going to move that down to much smaller, and I'm going to work actually with this outline, and I'm going to hide the first one. All right, so I'm going to work with this. What I want to do is I ultimately want to center it in this box, but let's play with it a bit more. So first, I'll just use the move tool to bring it about in the middle. And what I want to do here is just start playing with letting and tracking. So letting is the line spacing. Letting and line spacing are the same thing. And that is basically the space between the lines. And that is indicated by this little indicator right here. Right now it's 82. It seems like it's a little far away. And then tracking is the space between the letters. So it's the horizontal spacing between the letters. So I think it actually seems a little narrow. So I'm going to move it like that. So these are two different functions that you can do to play with these, and we will animate these here in a second. But right now, I kind of want it to be centered in this box. I know the box is centered, but the text is not quite centered. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is go right here. I'll turn on my spotlight. And I'm going to make sure, I'm going to turn on the title action safe grid. This is the same thing that is in Illustrator. These do not ever print, they never render, but they kind of show you where text is safe. You don't really want text outside of these boxes because it kind of falls off, and depending on what screen you're on, it may not render on top. So you can basically see there's like a standard definition television in the center and various other places that titles can go. But I would say you keep your text within these boxes. Now, yes, you can sit and eyeball and try and move this, but right now the anchor point is not in the center. So I'm going to go ahead and select this letting and tracking layer, and I'm going to kind of automatically center it. And I'm going to go to Layer, Transform. I'll turn on my spotlight. I'm going to center the anchor point in the layer content. If you recall, I'll get out here, the anchor point is kind of high right now, and I want it just whatever is the actual center point, I want it there. So I'm going to do Layer, Transform, Center Anchor Point in Layer Content. Now that is centered, and then I'm going to go to Layer, Transform, Center in View. And that's going to basically center that anchor point into the center. So that's actually as mathematically centered as possible. So we have played a little bit with letting and tracking just to have it still, but some text elements, a lot of these text elements don't just automatically respond to animations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up this letting and tracking and open up this text here. And you'll see there's a little section here called Animate. And I'm going to animate. Let's start with, well, just add a tracking. And so what this is going to do is I'm going to go to tracking amount. And so it keeps this as the standard tracking amount. So I'm going to add a keyframe here and a keyframe there. I'm going to go back to this first keyframe, and I'm going to turn that tracking back because I want this text to kind of like expand. And I want to do the same thing for letting or line spacing. So I'm going to go to text and go to animate and go to line spacing. That's going to add another animator to this. Same thing. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to get some keyframes. Go back and I'm going to start line spacing, yeah. And I'm going to try and line these up so it just starts out with a jumble of noise like that. And that way, that's way too fast, so I'm going to move these guys and move them out. And then now I have an animation for letting and tracking. So that is the basics of working with text in After Effects. I'm going to stop this so we have a little break, and then I'm going to deal with importing text from Illustrator and Photoshop.